Before Jane Fonda became a symbol of transformation, controversy, and unbreakable spirit, she was simply the daughter of a man the world already adored. Born on December 21, 1937 in New York City, Jane Seymour Fonda entered the world with a last name that already carried significant weight. Her father, Henry Fonda, was one of the most respected and revered actors in American cinema. To millions, he was the ideal of integrity on screen, the moral compass of Hollywood classics like The Grapes of Wrath and 12 Angry Men. But to young Jane, he was something far more complex, distant, stoic, often emotionally unavailable. Jane's early life wasn't defined by red carpets or glamorous photo ops. It was shaped by silence, shadows, and the pain that often exists behind fame. Her mother, Frances Ford Seymour, came from Canadian high society and struggled deeply with her own emotional health. Jane would later speak with raw honesty about the chilling truth that her mother had been sexually abused in childhood, a legacy of trauma that left deep marks. When Jane was just 12 years old, her mother died by suicide in a psychiatric hospital. The trauma of that moment would haunt her for decades. In a family where appearances mattered more than emotional openness, Jane was taught to repress, to smile through pain, and to live in the shadow of her father's public virtue and private distance. Growing up in such a household planted the early seeds of contradiction within Jane. On the outside, she seemed poised, beautiful, and destined for greatness. But on the inside, she wrestled with feelings of inadequacy, guilt, and emotional detachment. Her relationship with her father remained formal, almost businesslike, for most of her young life. He rarely showed affection, and praise was hard-earned and seldom given. Still, Jane longed for his approval and would spend a large portion of her adult life chasing that elusive connection. Her education, like much of her youth, was shaped by privilege and performance. Jane attended elite schools and developed a reputation for being smart and poised. But she was also rebellious, constantly searching for identity beyond the Fonda name. As a teenager, Jane became increasingly fascinated by the world of performance, not necessarily to follow in her father's footsteps, but as a means of self-discovery. Art, acting, and expression became her escape from the emotional vacuum of her childhood. She studied art in Paris, considered becoming a painter, and eventually gravitated toward the theater. It was not her name, but her own quiet resilience that pushed her toward the spotlight. She took acting classes in New York under the legendary Lee Strasberg, founder of the Method School of Acting. Strasberg, who had trained icons like Marlon, Brando, and James Dean, immediately saw something in Jane, something raw, authentic, and burning beneath the surface. He told her she had real talent, and for a young woman who had never felt truly seen by her own father, that affirmation lit a fire within her. Jane's journey into acting was not smooth or easy. She battled profound self-doubt, struggled with her appearance, and often questioned her own worth. But what made her different, and what would eventually make her a legend, was her willingness to keep pushing forward. Even in the face of rejection and fear, she leaned in. She studied, worked hard, and grew with every role. Before the world knew her as an icon, Jane Fonda was just a girl trying to break free of the chains of legacy, family dysfunction, and inner turmoil. The glamour would come later. The fame, the awards, the headlines, those were still years away. But the foundation of who she would become was already forming. A fighter, a survivor, and eventually, a woman who would not only confront her past, but use it as fuel to change the world. Jane Fonda's entry into show business wasn't guaranteed, even with the Fonda name. She could have quietly stepped into the world of upper class, comfort, or married into prestige and disappeared from the public eye. But Jane didn't want that. She was driven by something far more complex, the need to find her own identity, a desire to be seen, and perhaps most of all, to be heard on her own terms. In her early 20s, Jane found work as a model. Her face, structured, elegant, almost sculptural, graced the covers of fashion magazines like Vogue multiple times. In photographs, she radiated poise and polish, but inside, she was still fighting for a sense of direction. Modeling gave her visibility, but not fulfillment. What she craved was emotional truth, something deeper than camera flashes and compliments. Her turning point came when she returned to New York and enrolled at the Actors Studio, where she studied under the formidable Lee Strasberg. It was there that Jane began to peel away the protective layers built from years of emotional withholding. Strasberg didn't just teach acting, he demanded authenticity. Under his mentorship, Jane discovered that performance wasn't about pretending. It was about revealing. Acting became a form of therapy, a way to understand herself by stepping into the lives of others. In 1960, she landed her first major film role in Tall Story, opposite Anthony Perkins. The film wasn't a box office smash, but it was enough to plant her firmly on the map as an up-and-coming actress. From there, Jane's career began to gain traction. Through the early 1960s, she appeared in a string of light comedies and romantic dramas, often playing the pretty ingenue. Critics noted her charm and talent, but something was missing, something Jane herself felt. She didn't want to be typecast. She didn't want to be another pretty face with a famous last name. In 1965, Jane took a bold leap by accepting a role in the Broadway play The Fun Couple, proving she could hold her own on the live stage. Around this time, her life also became tabloid fodder due to her high-profile marriage to French director Roger Vadim. Vadim had previously been married to Brigitte Bardot and was known for pushing boundaries. When he cast Jane in Barbarella, 1968, the world saw a version of her it had never seen before. Bold, sensual, futuristic, and fearless. Though critics were divided on the film itself, Jane had, intentionally or not, rebranded herself as someone unafraid to take creative risks. But it wasn't until the 1970s that Jane Fonda truly emerged as a force in serious cinema. With They Shoot Horses, Don't They? 1969, she delivered a gritty, emotionally raw performance that earned her an Academy Award nomination. She followed that with her Oscar-winning role in Clute, 1971, where she played a call girl entangled in a murder investigation. It was a daring, complex role, and Jane embraced every layer of it. Critics raved. Audiences were stunned. She had arrived, not as a beauty or a name, but as a formidable actress in her own right. By the time the 1970s were in full swing, Jane Fonda had fully shed the image of a model-turned-actress. She was now a bona fide star with dramatic range, a unique voice, and an unpredictable spirit. But stardom didn't silence the inner restlessness. If anything, it amplified it. She had the spotlight now, and with it came a pressing question. What would she do with it? For Jane, finding her voice wasn't just about nailing performances. It was about discovering the power of her platform. And as the world would soon see, she intended to use it, not just for acting, but for activism, truth-telling, and radical change. By the late 1960s, Jane Fonda had positioned herself at the crossroads of glamour and grit. Her role in Barbarella, 1968, directed by then-husband Roger Vadim, was a bold, sensual leap into the world of science fiction, equal parts fantasy, satire, and political statement. Clad in futuristic, barely there costumes, Jane embodied a space-traveling heroine who defied traditional ideas of femininity. The film was visually provocative and, in some ways, ahead of its time. But Barbarella didn't just launch Jane into sex symbol status. It sparked controversy and, ironically, served as a turning point. Though she embraced the role at the time, Jane later reflected that Barbarella didn't reflect her true voice. She began to feel used, objectified by the camera, and reduced to a caricature of sensuality. She once said she was miserable during filming. The glitz, the costumes, the fantasy, none of it aligned with the woman she was becoming. Jane Fonda wasn't just evolving as an actress. She was awakening as a woman and a citizen of the world. Then came Klute, 1971, a performance that changed everything. Directed by Alan J. Pakula, Klute gave Jane a role that shattered all previous expectations. She played Bree Daniels, a New York City call girl with a sharp mind, wounded heart, and layers of vulnerability hidden behind a polished exterior. Bree wasn't a stereotype. She wasn't just there to titillate or be saved. She was complicated, fiercely intelligent, and battling internal demons that made her profoundly real. To prepare for the role, Jane immersed herself in research, meeting with real sex workers, absorbing their stories, and understanding the societal forces that shaped their lives. Her commitment to authenticity stunned the industry. Her performance was magnetic, at once tough and fragile, cynical and yearning. It was the kind of role that demanded emotional bravery, and Jane delivered with stunning nuance. For her portrayal, she won the Academy Award for Best Actress, her first Oscar. But more than the accolade, Klute marked the beginning of a new Jane Fonda. She was no longer content to play roles written for the male gaze or dictated by Hollywood's outdated ideals. She would choose stories that mattered, roles that challenged perceptions, characters that exposed the cracks in society. The years that followed would see Jane taking on projects that spoke directly to the political and emotional pulse of the nation. Coming Home, 1978, where she played the wife of a Vietnam soldier who falls in love with a paraplegic veteran, was not just another dramatic role, it was a searing critique of war, masculinity, and emotional suppression. Her performance earned her a second Academy Award. But perhaps more importantly, it confirmed her place as a fearless artist, unafraid to confront the hardest truths. In The China Syndrome, 1979, she starred alongside Jack Lemmon and Michael Douglas in a tense thriller about a nuclear meltdown. The film was released just 12 days before the real-life 3 Mile Island disaster, and suddenly Jane was no longer just an actress playing a part. She was a prophet sounding the alarm. Her screen presence was evolving into something powerful, political, and deeply personal. Hollywood was changing, and Jane Fonda was leading the charge, not just as an actress but as a cultural force. She refused to be pigeonholed. She demanded more from herself, from her scripts, and from the society that consumed them. What made this period of her career so defining wasn't just her choice of roles. It was the intention behind them. Jane Fonda was done being silent, done playing it safe. She had discovered that cinema could be a tool for transformation, and she would use it to break stereotypes, ignite conversation, and give voice to the stories that often went untold. In the early 1970s, Jane Fonda's journey took a turn that would forever redefine her public identity, not just as an actress, but as a lightning rod for political outrage. While many celebrities dabbled in advocacy from a distance, Jane plunged headfirst into the fire. Her activism surrounding the Vietnam War remains one of the most polarizing chapters in American pop culture history, a moment when stardom collided with ideology, and the fallout reverberated for decades. As the Vietnam War dragged on, and thousands of young American soldiers died in a conflict growing increasingly unpopular, Jane began to feel deeply disturbed by what she was seeing. She wasn't content to sit quietly. She read, she studied, she listened, particularly to the voices of returning veterans who expressed shame, confusion, and anger over what they had seen and done. For Jane, the war wasn't just a political issue. It was a moral crisis. In 1972, she made the fateful decision to travel to North Vietnam. Officially, the trip was to meet with civilians, doctors, and political figures. But one moment defined the entire visit. and tainted her image permanently in the eyes of many Americans. That moment was the photograph of Jane Fonda sitting on a North Vietnamese anti-aircraft gun, smiling among Vietnamese soldiers. The photo, circulated globally, sparked immediate outrage in the United States. To critics, it looked like treason. AI, famous American siding with the enemy, literally posing with the machinery used to shoot down American pilots. She was labeled Hanoi Jane, a nickname that would follow her for the rest of her life. Overnight, she went from celebrated actress to public enemy. Protesters burned her image in effigy, veterans groups condemned her, politicians called for her arrest. But the story, like Jane herself, was far more complicated than the headlines. In later interviews, she expressed deep regret over the photo, calling it a thoughtless mistake and acknowledging the pain it caused. However, she never apologized for her opposition to the war. She believed, and still believes, that America's actions in Vietnam were wrong and that silence would have made her complicit. Her trip included visits to hospitals, bomb shelters, and schools destroyed by American airstrikes. She spoke out against the use of napalm, the targeting of civilians, and the treatment of prisoners. These were not the actions of someone seeking attention. They were the passionate choices of someone who believed she had a moral obligation to use her platform for justice. The experience left Jane scarred in ways she couldn't have imagined. Film roles dried up. Death threats became common. Her own father was reportedly ashamed and angry. And yet, even under fire, she refused to back down. She took part in anti-war rallies, spoke at colleges, and partnered with Vietnam veterans who shared her beliefs. What makes this chapter of Jane's life so profound is not just the controversy, it's the courage. She could have remained comfortable and beloved, safe behind her Oscars and box office success, but she chose conscience over career. It was a decision that cost her dearly professionally and personally, and yet for Jane, it was necessary. In later years, even some of her harshest critics would come to see her activism with more nuance. While many still disagreed with her methods, few could deny her conviction. Jane Fonda had forced the country to look at its darkest truths, and whether America loved her or hated her, it could no longer ignore her. After years of political backlash, career volatility, and intense emotional strain, many assumed Jane Fonda might retreat from the spotlight, or at least take a step back. But once again, Jane did something completely unexpected. In the 1980s, she reinvented herself, this time not through film or protest, but through sweat, strength, and a pair of brightly colored leg warmers. Jane Fonda's leap into the fitness world began as a deeply personal mission. At the time, she was in her early 40s, a period when Hollywood often discarded women or forced them into roles of mothers and side characters. But Jane was determined to stay relevant, strong, and in control of her own body. Years of battling self-image issues, bulimia, and public scrutiny had taught her that taking control of her health was about more than appearance. It was about empowerment. What began as a simple interest in exercise quickly became a global phenomenon. In 1982, Jane released Jane Fonda's Workout, a home exercise video that would redefine the fitness industry forever. At a time when VCRs were just becoming household staples, her video offered something revolutionary, a guided, accessible, and fun way for women, especially those who felt intimidated by gyms, to work out at home. Wearing leotards, tights, and a confident smile, Jane became the face of a fitness revolution. Her routine blended aerobics with strength, grace, and an encouraging tone that made viewers feel like they weren't just exercising, they were taking control of their lives. The video wasn't just popular, it was seismic. It sold over 17 million copies, becoming the best-selling VHS tape of all time. But Jane didn't stop at one tape. She launched an entire empire, follow-up workout videos, books, audio programs, and a branded lifestyle that emphasized not just physical health, but mental and emotional wellness. For millions of women, Jane Fonda became a role model, not just because of her celebrity status, but because of her relatability. She talked openly about aging, self-worth, and the fight to stay visible in a culture obsessed with youth. The fitness movement also allowed Jane to reconnect with her body in a way that healed old wounds. Having struggled with eating disorders and body dysmorphia for decades, she now saw her physicality as a source of strength, not shame. Exercise became a form of therapy, a way to combat depression, fear, and insecurity. Critics, of course, didn't stay silent. Some accused her of capitalizing on trends. Others dismissed her workouts as superficial, but Jane saw it differently. She knew she was doing more than selling tapes. She was helping women across the world discover autonomy and energy at a time when many felt left behind. She once said, "I became identified with this new version of femininity, strong, independent, unapologetic." Financially, the fitness brand was a triumph, generating millions and giving Jane financial independence like never before. But more than wealth, it gave her influence beyond Hollywood, a kind of cultural relevance rooted not in glamour, but in impact. And while she still acted during this period, most notably in On Golden Pond alongside her father, Henry Fonda, the fitness phase represented a uniquely Jane Fonda moment, bold, visionary, against the grain. Once again, she was reshaping what it meant to be a woman in America. Jane Fonda's workout tapes did more than transform bodies. They transformed lives. And in doing so, they solidified her legacy as not just an actress or activist, but a trailblazer who could reinvent herself and inspire others to do the same.